Picture this. You are looking at a 9-year-old boy pressed against a cold window, and something inside his eyes tells a story that most adults have forgotten how to read. This isn't just another tale about childhood struggles. This is about understanding the invisible blueprint that turns innocent children into walking targets, and how that blueprint follows them into adulthood, like a shadow they can't shake. You see, when psychologists study bullying patterns, they've discovered something that might shock you. The children who become victims aren't randomly selected. There is actually a psychological profile, a specific emotional signature that bullies can detect almost instinctively. And it all starts at home, in the quietest moments when no one else is watching. Let me tell you about the boy at the window. His name was Aidan, and at 9 years old, he had already learned one of life's cruelest lessons. That love might be something you have to earn rather than something you simply receive. His father's eyes held the temperature of winter mornings. Not hostile, just absent. Not angry, just empty. And in that emptiness, Aidan found the first crack in his sense of self-worth. Here is what happens in the developing brain of a child who experiences emotional neglect. Your nervous system doesn't understand the complexity of adult emotions or circumstances. It doesn't rationalize that maybe your parent is struggling with their own demons. Instead, it draws the simplest, most devastating conclusion possible. If the person who is supposed to love me unconditionally doesn't seem to care, then I must be fundamentally unworthy of care. This belief becomes what psychologists call a core schema, essentially the operating system for how you view yourself and relationships. And once this schema is installed, it runs in the background of every interaction, every friendship, every moment when you are trying to connect with another human being. But here is where the story gets really interesting from a psychological perspective. When Aidan walked into his classroom, he didn't just carry his backpack and pencils. He carried an invisible sign that only other children could somehow read. It said, "I will do anything to be accepted." And that desperation, that hunger for approval, created a dynamic that other kids could sense and exploit. Think about the last time you were around someone who was trying too hard to be liked. You probably felt it before you consciously recognized it, right? There is something in their body language, their laugh, their eagerness to please, that feels slightly off balance. Children are actually more attuned to these emotional frequencies than adults are. They haven't yet learned to intellectualize their gut reactions. So when Aidan offered his lunch to classmates, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and did homework for others, he thought he was building friendships. But what he was actually doing was advertising his vulnerability. The other children didn't see kindness. They saw desperation, and desperation, unfortunately, often triggers cruelty rather than compassion in developing minds. This is where we need to understand something crucial about childhood psychology. When children haven't developed secure attachment patterns at home, they develop what researchers call insecure attachment strategies. One of the most common is called anxious attachment, or what some therapists refer to as fawning behavior. Fawning is essentially a survival strategy where you learn to anticipate and meet other people's needs before they even express them. You become hypervigilant about other people's moods. You learn to read micro-expressions, tone shifts, body language cues that might indicate disapproval or rejection, and then you adjust your behavior accordingly, often erasing your own needs and preferences in the process. For Aidan, this meant that every social interaction became an exhausting performance. He wasn't just being himself with his classmates. He was constantly monitoring their reactions and modifying his responses to maximize their approval. But here is the psychological trap. Authentic connection requires authenticity. When you are performing rather than being, you might gain temporary approval, but you'll never achieve genuine intimacy. And children, with their still developing emotional intelligence, often interpret performed behavior as fake or weird, even if they can't articulate why. This is why Aidan's desperate attempts to connect often backfired, making him more isolated rather than more accepted. The bullying that followed wasn't random cruelty. It was a predictable response to the psychological dynamic he had unknowingly created. When you signal that your self-worth depends on other people's approval, you are essentially handing them power over your emotional state. And some children, especially those dealing with their own insecurities or traumas, We'll use that power in destructive ways. But let's dig deeper into what was happening in Aiden's mind during those moments of rejection and ridicule. Each cruel comment, each laugh at his expense, each time he was excluded from a group, his brain interpreted these experiences through the lens of his existing core belief. I am unworthy of love. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information in ways that confirm our existing beliefs. So instead of thinking, those kids are being mean, Aiden thought, they're right to exclude me because there is something wrong with me. This pattern creates what researchers call a negative feedback loop. The more he believed he was unworthy, the more desperately he tried to prove his worth through pleasing behaviors. The more desperately he tried to please, the more other children sensed his vulnerability and either pulled away or exploited it. The more they pulled away or exploited it, the more convinced he became that he was fundamentally flawed. Now, here is where the story becomes not just tragic, but fascinating from a neuroscientific perspective. When a child's brain is repeatedly exposed to rejection and has to constantly monitor for social threats, it actually rewires itself around vigilance and people pleasing. The neural pathways that govern self-advocacy, boundary setting, and authentic self-expression become underdeveloped, while the pathways related to threat detection and appeasement become overdeveloped. This neurological adaptation is brilliant for surviving an emotionally dangerous childhood environment. If your safety depends on keeping others happy, then developing an almost supernatural ability to read and respond to other people's moods is actually a life-saving skill. What saves you as a child often sabotages you as an adult. Those same neural pathways that helped Aiden survive his childhood continued to operate long after he had grown up and moved into adult relationships where such extreme vigilance and self-sacrifice weren't necessary. As an adult, Aiden found himself attracted to people who were emotionally unavailable, just like his father had been, not because he consciously wanted to recreate his childhood pain, but because emotional unavailability felt familiar. His brain had been wired to associate love with having to work for it, to earn it, to prove himself worthy of it. In romantic relationships, he became the partner who always accommodated, who never fought, who apologized even when he hadn't done anything wrong. He mistook this pattern for being a good partner, but what it actually represented was his childhood trauma playing out in adult scenarios. At work, he became the employee who stayed late without being asked, who took on extra projects without additional compensation, who smiled and agreed even when he disagreed. He thought this made him valuable, but it often made him invisible, just another person who could be counted on to say yes, regardless of the personal cost. And in friendships, he remained the reliable one, the one who always listened but rarely shared, the one who gave advice but never asked for it, the one who showed up for others but rarely asked others to show up for him. The psychological term for this pattern is codependency, but that clinical label doesn't capture the full tragedy of what is happening. This isn't just about being too giving or too accommodating. This is about a fundamental disconnection from your own inner world, your desires, your boundaries, your authentic responses to life. When you've spent your entire childhood learning that your value depends on your usefulness to others, you never develop a strong sense of intrinsic worth. You don't learn to ask yourself questions like, what do I want? Or how do I feel about this? Or what are my boundaries? Instead, you learn to ask, what do they want from me? And how can I make sure they're not upset with me? But here is where psychology offers us hope. The same neuroplasticity that allowed Aiden's brain to adapt to a difficult childhood environment also means that his brain can be rewired toward healthier patterns. It is not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it is possible. The journey of healing for someone like Aiden typically begins with what therapists call reparenting. Essentially, learning to give yourself the emotional support and unconditional acceptance that you didn't receive as a child. This isn't about blaming parents or dwelling in victimhood. It is about recognizing that certain developmental needs weren't met and taking responsibility for meeting them now, as an adult. For Aiden, this meant learning to sit with his own emotions without immediately trying to fix them or make them more palatable for others. It meant discovering his own preferences, opinions, and boundaries, things he had never been encouraged to develop as a child. Honor of the most powerful therapeutic breakthroughs happened when Aidan realized that he had been living his entire life as if he were still that 9-year-old boy trying to earn his father's approval. Every boss became his father, every romantic partner became his father, every friend became someone whose approval he needed to survive. But he wasn't 9 years old anymore. He had his own resources, his own income, his own ability to choose who to spend time with and who to distance himself from. The survival strategies that had made sense as a powerless child were no longer necessary for a capable adult. Learning to say no became his first act of rebellion against his childhood programming. At first, it felt terrifying, like he was risking abandonment every time he declined a request or expressed a contrary opinion. But gradually, he began to notice something surprising. The people who truly cared about him respected his boundaries, and the people who got angry when he set boundaries revealed themselves to be people who had been taking advantage of his people-pleasing tendencies. This is one of the most important psychological insights about recovery from childhood trauma. Healthy people want you to have boundaries. They want you to be authentic. They want you to take care of yourself. Only unhealthy people benefit from your lack of boundaries and your tendency to self-sacrifice. As Aidan began to develop a stronger sense of self, something interesting happened in his relationships. The people who had been drawn to his people-pleasing qualities started to lose interest or become frustrated with him. But new people began to enter his life. People who were attracted to his authenticity rather than his agreeableness. For the first time, he began to experience what psychologists call secure attachment. Relationships where he could be himself, express his needs, disagree when necessary, and still feel loved and accepted. These relationships felt foreign at first, almost uncomfortable, because they were so different from the conditional love he had grown accustomed to. But perhaps the most profound change was in his relationship with himself. For the first time since childhood, Aidan began to develop what psychologists call intrinsic self-worth, a sense of value that didn't depend on other people's approval or disapproval. He started to notice his own thoughts and feelings without immediately judging them as right or wrong, good or bad. He began to trust his own instincts and perceptions instead of automatically deferring to others. And slowly, very slowly, he began to believe that he was worthy of love and respect simply because he existed, not because of what he could do for others. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without setbacks. Old patterns have a way of reasserting themselves during times of stress or vulnerability. But each time Aidan caught himself falling back into people-pleasing behaviors, he could recognize what was happening and make a conscious choice to respond differently. The boy who had once sat at that window, desperate for his father's attention, had grown into a man who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. The child who had believed that love must be earned through perfect behavior had become an adult who understood that real love is unconditional. But this story isn't just about one person's journey from trauma to healing. It is about understanding the invisible ways that childhood experiences shape our adult relationships, our career choices, our sense of self-worth, and our ability to form authentic connections with others. If you recognize elements of Aidan's story in your own life, you are not alone. Millions of people carry similar patterns. The legacy of childhoods where love felt conditional, where approval had to be earned, where being good meant disappearing your own needs and desires. The beautiful thing about understanding these patterns is that awareness itself is the first step toward change. When you can recognize that your people-pleasing tendencies aren't just personality traits, but learned survival strategies from childhood, you can begin to question whether those strategies still serve you in your adult life. And here is what psychology has taught us about healing from these patterns. It is never too late to learn how to love yourself unconditionally. It is never too late to develop healthy boundaries. It is never too late to discover who you are underneath all the roles you've played to earn other people's approval. The child who was once bullied can become the adult who stands up for themselves and others. The child who once begged for scraps of attention can become the adult who commands respect through authenticity rather than accommodation. The child who once believed they were fundamentally unworthy can become the adult who knows, without question, that they deserve love, respect, and acceptance exactly as they are. That 9-year-old boy at the window thought he needed to become someone else to be loved. The healed adult he became understood that he had always been enough, exactly as he was. The only thing that needed to change was his belief about his own worthiness. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful psychological truth of all. We are not broken people who need to be fixed. We are wounded people who need to be healed. And healing begins the moment we stop trying to earn love and start learning to accept it. First from ourselves, and then from others who have the capacity to give it freely. The boy at the window grew up to become a man who could finally see his own reflection clearly, not through the distorted lens of childhood trauma, but through the clear vision of self-acceptance. And in that reflection, he saw not someone who needed to be perfect to be loved, but someone who was perfectly lovable in his imperfection. That is the journey from victim to survivor to thriver. That is the path from childhood trauma to adult wholeness. And that is the story that every person who has ever felt unseen, unwanted, or unloved has the power to write for themselves.